very much. It's my great honor to be here. I worked for Jerry many years ago and inspired by his role in providing leadership, and I'm very pleased that he couldn't stay in retirement, had to come out and create this youth movement. So you guys are inheriting this future, and I hope I'm going to give you some bits of facts and knowledge that might enable you to make it a little bit better. And Elizabeth did a great, I wouldn't call it an elevator speech, maybe once and twice up and down, but she did a very good synopsis of the role that the environment can play in sequestering carbon, particularly soils, and there are many beneficial aspects of it. So this is our planet. We're not trying to save the Earth. The Earth will do fine, but the question is, are we going to be able to live on it? We have to save ourselves, and we have that potential. So I want to highlight, many of you probably pay attention to the news, but I want to give a little bit of a quick refresh on where we are in terms of global warming. My kind of spin on the Paris talks, and particularly focusing on the best piece of news that came out for me, which is this 4P1000 initiative, and then to give you some of the strategies that we think are possible for helping to sequester carbon and how we can do that. So clearly it's happening now. You know all the mechanisms. We're increasing the blanket of CO2. It's causing us to trap the infrared heat, and it's showing up in all sorts of places. We've noticed, particularly in the last few months, very extreme temperatures. We hope it's just El Nino, but we fear that it may be beyond that as we switch into the new Pacific regime. We hope we might see a little bit of cooling, but so far not so much. CO2 is the biggest villain, or the charismatic molecule, but there are these other molecules. Water vapor, I want to touch on a little bit later, is a complex one. It can both help to heat and to cool the planet, depending on how it's managed. Nitrous oxides primarily coming from using our fossil fuel-based fertilizers. And methane is waiting in the wings. We're fearful that with the thawing tundra and perhaps warming oceans that we're going to see a lot more methane. Fortunately, it's a relatively short-lived molecule, and if we can do other things, we might be able to weather a storm of methane if we can get the temperature back down again through other means. Sorry, this is such a dark slide, but this is what we've seen. The line is the average over the period, the zero line. We're seeing just clearly a trend that can't persist for much longer. The UN FCC, we initially said we must limit warming to 2 degrees. The consensus that emerged from Paris was we need to keep it down to 1.5. This is the deviations that we're seeing. This is already out of date. As of May, the parts per million had reached 407.7, the largest increase in any year ever. I wanted to particularly highlight the oscillation. You'll see in the inset graph, the range is about 3 parts per million. And in this problem, turning the negative into a positive, this oscillation shows us the power of nature. About 2/3 of the terrestrial land mass is in the northern hemisphere, about 1/3 in the southern. So in the springtime, we see a drawdown, spring to summer, that's largely driven by the northern hemisphere. It's offset by the fall, the CO2 that's being released, oxidation primarily of soils and leaves and so forth, vegetation in the southern hemisphere. So actually the power of nature is even bigger than this because nature is working against itself. But that range, if we could trap 6 parts per million, keep it in the ground every year on year on year, it would only take us a few decades to get back to pre-industrial levels of CO2. So that's partly what we're talking about, is the potential of working with nature instead of interrupting what it's tried to evolve to do. This is the latest record showing you that we've nearly broken 408 parts per million, and probably next year we're not going to go below 400 parts per million. So we're in a new regime, a very fearful one. This is long-term trends. Most of us won't be alive, but this is the legacy we're leaving if we don't solve this problem of affecting ice melt and other feedback loops that will put us into a higher temperature regime. So we have a short window of opportunity to act to make a difference here. And you can see we're already well above what the planet might consider recent normal. We're seeing extreme weather, category 5 kinds of weather, flooding and devastation. Just this, last 2 weeks, high temperatures in India, flooding in Europe, Paris, the Seine overflowing, so forth. This was last year, but showing you that when you factor in all the various aspects of how we perceive temperature, we're really into dangerous. If you don't have air conditioning, you're not able to cool. If there are sustained temperatures in the 120s, it begins to affect your processes. Proteins in the brain start to denature at 119 degrees Fahrenheit. So if you have no way to cool yourself, you start to go crazy, literally. List of known, iteration of the various impacts. There are others. There's a report that says that a significant part of the conflict in Syria is probably driven by the drought, which forced farmers to come into the city, and the urban infrastructure wasn't able to handle them. So we're seeing the climatic impacts play out politically, geopolitically. So these are the issues. I'm wearing red, we're in an emergency situation, accelerating changes and feedbacks that are playing on each other. We don't seem to be able to solve the problem politically, so I think we need to rely on more grassroots, literally, strategies. And we're fearful about high-tech geoengineering. There was something in the news this week about Iceland scientists being able to sequester carbon. But if you do the arithmetic, take it from the lab bench out into the world, it really is not scalable. So our little organization, Biodiversity Available Climate, we're not opposed to emissions caps, all the various other things to try to get our fossil fuel consumption to zero. Those need to proceed apace, but we think there's also other things that we can do. Paris agreement came out stronger than expected, but it's still imperfect. The limit was to keep warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Unfortunately, we may, as under the not so good column here, we may break through that in the next couple of years. There was a study, I believe it was in the New Yorker magazine, a team of modelers looked at the various scenarios for what the COP21 plan would do, and there was some wiggle room, but in general would not make much of a difference. It's a voluntary compliance thing, so it really depends on us as citizens to get our governments to act. This was just a couple weeks ago, showing that our temperature increases are already approaching that target. So what I'm bringing is, what if there's more to the story, if there's something that we can do that might make a difference, and biology has been hinted as the potential. So we're looking here at sort of the flows. This may be hard to read, and you're probably very familiar with it. But the things in particular are in red are the ones that humans have some control over. The contributions to atmospheric carbon, and also our fossil fuel use and land use practices. And as Julia mentioned, the oceans are suffering because of the CO2, so that's another area where we can make a difference. Bill Muma is one of the authors of the UNFCCC reports, presented this at the Tufts conference that we did a couple of years ago that sort of got me started on all of this, as looking at the atmosphere as a tub of water. It's really of air, but we have emissions filling it up, and we have the drain taking it out. And right now the emissions are double what we're taking out, but we can change the net removals. And of course we can also try to turn off the tap. So, is it, reduce the emissions, increase uptake, or do both? So, as Elizabeth mentioned, we have this marvelous invention of biological technology called chlorophyll, taking sunlight, water, and CO2 and turning it into sugars and starches. We're learning that, like an iceberg where you only see the tip of it, and there's a lot more below the surface, the same is true of plants. It turns out that in a healthy forest, about a third of the carbon storage is above ground and 2/3 is below ground, in the roots, in the soil organic matter, and in particular all the fungal networks, bacteria and other living organisms that are part of the partnership that enables that plant to grow in the first place. Plants came to land, colonize land that had already been colonized by fungus. And that fungus provided the sort of the intranet that allowed them to communicate and get the nutrients they need, the water they needed, and so forth. The photo, it's hard to see, but it's showing the roots, but attached to the root are all the fungal, the mycelial networks that extend the reach of the roots, both for getting moisture and minerals. The plants share somewhere between, depending on the species of the plant, 20 to 50% of the sugars that they produce are exuded through the roots in this symbiotic relationship with the fungal networks. And there's actual communication that goes on and says, I need this kind of mineral, go find it and bring it back to me, and so forth. So the article itself that's referenced there is also very interesting in terms of the impact on human health because of the nutrients that these fungal networks and relationships add to the stuff that we depend on for our food. So this is an exhibit that was at the Smithsonian Botanical Garden a year or so ago that shows how deep some of these species, the perennial species of prairie grass, can be. And the fact that what you see above ground represents only part of the potential that these have. This diagram sort of more in black and white, and if you look at the far left, you'll see the species of grass that we put on our lawns. Very short, doesn't sequester very much carbon. So one of the things you can do as a strategy is change the species of grass you have on your lawn, if you want to have a lawn. This is giving you a sense, 3 to 4 feet of topsoil that initially existed on the prairies that were destroyed through the practice of tillage agriculture, which overturns that carbon, breaks up all the relationships with the roots and the fungal networks, and allows it to oxidize. The integrity breaks down and it all blows away. We can reverse that process. Turns out somewhere between 30 and 40% of the, what I call the anthropogenic CO2 in the atmosphere came from land use management, not from burning fossil fuels, but through deforestation and a significant portion from oxidation of soils. We're turning our soils to sand. They're becoming holding mechanisms for applying chemicals. We're losing the nutrient value of some of our foods has declined by 50% over the last 100 years because we have broken this relationship. This map, if you look at the darkest colors, the red and the dark yellow, is showing you the potential we have for transforming our relationship to the land in a way that could draw down carbon. So these are soils that we've abused, salinated, extracted the minerals from, broken up the structure, they've eroded. Some of them are in what we now call desert systems, but many of these were just arid ecosystems that have been maltreated and have become deserts, so we can undo a lot of that. But it's a huge amount of land area. Anybody know what paleosols are? Yeah, fossil soils. So one of our first speakers at this conference at Tufts was an expert in paleosols and looked at the era when ruminants and grasses evolved. They co-evolved. So grasses in a healthy ecosystem depend upon cows or grazers, whatever, to foster the relationship that allows them to sequester nutrients and carbon into the soil. So many of these areas are going to be dependent upon our use of animals managed properly to help sequester the carbon, but they provide a huge potential. I'll make the slides available. I recommend watching this. We don't have time for it now, but Michael Pollan narrates a very nice synopsis of this. So soil carbon farming is basically using agroecological processes to sequester carbon in the soil. And you have all these other benefits that come out of it. Regenerative agriculture is another similar term, slightly different definition. But I just want to give you a list, and I'm going to show some pictures of these things. Organic farming was trying to make sure we didn't add all the sort of artificial practices, fertilizers, pesticides, and so forth, get those out so that they wouldn't pollute us. But it largely focused on the food. 2.0 was kind of standardizing that, making it clear when you were purchasing something that said organic what it actually meant. And now Organic 3.0 is actually paying more attention to what's happening in the soil and the whole ecosystem, and trying to make sure that practices are not only producing healthy food, but creating a healthy ecosystem. Holistic management of grasslands, as I touched on in the previous sort of map, is where the greatest potential is. Of course, forest restoration, wetlands restoration. Wetlands can probably, it was hinted for the blue carbon, but also on, you know, riverine and marshes in freshwater systems can probably sequester twice what can be sequestered in forests and grasslands. We also have things like biochar, doing things to make the soil healthier. So this one is Singing Frog Farms near Sebastopol, California. It's, I think, about 6 acres that's farmed intensively year-round. The climate allows for 3 crops. In the wintertime, obviously, the production is good, but Paul and Elizabeth Kaiser are now grossing about $100,000 an acre in the way they're producing it. So it's a lot of compost, a lot of cover crops, making sure there's no bare soil. It allows them to keep a labor force on the farm year-round, and that's a benefit because a lot of agriculture in California is dependent upon sort of migrant labor. And if you can stabilize some of that, it's healthy for the economy as well. So this is more photos of the kinds of things that they do. Mark Shepard up in Wisconsin, he's pioneering the use of forest agriculture and doing what's called key lime. Basically, instead of turning over the soil, they drag a knife blade through it and they plant seeds in it. So you haven't really disturbed the integrity of the soil except where you're planting seeds. He's planting on the contours forest crops. His idea is that chestnuts and hazelnuts, which have a higher protein caloric productivity than corn and have an economic value. Under that you have smaller bushes, you have fruits and so forth, and then down low you have your vegetable crops, and then grazing in between are pigs and chickens and goats and so forth. So you increase the time horizon, you know, the amount of time of the year you can actually be growing things. You have multi-species cropping and productivity, and you can be economically successful without having a lot of the fossil fuel inputs or fertilizer. It's all sort of self-working together. France has recognized that. They have this 4 pour 1,000. They're trying to support, through agricultural practices in France, the increase in soil organic carbon by 0.4% on an annual basis. They calculate that if they do that, that will offset what they produce through burning fossil fuels from the automobiles and power industry. So that allows them to get to net zero. That number is actually relatively conservative. It's possible to do not 0.4, but maybe perhaps 1 to 2% of soil carbon sequestration a year, so we could actually get beyond offsetting to zero and start drawing down some of the CO2 back into the soil. So this is how they, that previous chart's hard to read, so I pulled out some of the key points of what they're doing. And this last one is going after those red and yellow areas on the map. They provide a leadership. I've lost track of how many other countries have already said, you know, we're going to follow France. But here in the U.S., we've got a number of states that are taking leadership. I'm highlighting some of the bills that I'm aware of, and I've been working with some of the folks on the Maryland delegation to see if we can get something put in place for Maryland as well. And we have a long-term strategy of trying to affect the Farm Bill, which is renewed every 5 years. I'm told there's most of the stuff we want is in the Farm Bill, it's just not well funded, so we're going to be working on trying to improve that situation. And very recently in March, we had something introduced in Congress that we hope more people get behind. So one of the other aspects, how much time do I have? 3 minutes? Keeping soils covered is important for sort of microclimate effects. We want to keep it cool, protect the biology, but also the evapotranspirative. If you have sunlight hitting bare ground, it warms up the soil, it re-radiates as infrared, that contributes to global warming. If instead you have plants there and they are transpiring water, that sensate heat is transformed into latent heat through moisture. That moisture rises into the atmosphere, it's carried to the upper atmosphere where then it condenses and we get, you know, thunderstorms and rain. When it condenses, it's up at 20, 30, 50,000 feet, depending on the storm. Most of it radiates to space, and that water coming down is cooler. So if we can restore these, what are called small water cycles, we have the potential actually to pull heat off the surface of the Earth and send it back into space where we would like it to be. Holistic planned grazing is this invention by Alan Savory. There's probably somewhere between 40 and 100 million acres around the world that's being managed this way. There's a fence down the middle here. On the left is management of cattle using this holistic planned grazing, where you look at many different factors to determine when you bring cattle on. They're only on very briefly, they graze intensely. Sometimes the stocking densities can be 4 times what just a random grazing is. But they help the whole process of bringing nutrients into the soil, breaking up the soil, and they aren't on the land long enough to exhaust the plants, so the plants have a chance to green up once the cattle have left. On the right side, there's no stock. So you can see there's a difference. The joke is which side of the fence gets more rain. They both get the same amount of rain. It's the management strategy. The side on the left is sequestering more carbon. This was done, it's hard to see the dates. The picture on the left is the same piece of land using this method, 2006, 3 years later, 2009. The first annuals come and then perennials. The perennials have deeper roots. They allow the rain to percolate. Infiltration. On the left, most of when it rains, it washes away. On the right, it infiltrates. The water tables are coming back. Rivers are starting to flow again, etc. If you don't apply herbicides, pesticides, fungicides, you can foster that below ground activity, including dung beetles, scarab beetles, worldwide. We hardly see them here in the US because of what we do with pesticides. But when they come back, they will take cow patties on the surface, and within 48 hours they'll disappear. They bury them under the ground. So we need to foster those kinds of things. Work is coming out that scientifically backs up the potential. This is from Rodale Institute. I'm just going to skim through this. Some pictures. This is sort of the iconic haystack mountains around Rio de Janeiro. In the 1500s, when the Portuguese settled, they completely denuded all these mountains to grow coffee. And they discovered that the stream stopped running and the water supply for the city was threatened, they dried up. So in the 1800s, they hired 20 slaves who over the course of 30 years went to the remaining sort of repositories of the different species and began transplanting seedlings, and they completely reforested all these mountains, and Rio de Janeiro's water supply is now restored and safe. It's all protected parkland. These guys had, I think, 17,000 acres that they also embarked upon. It was a cattle grazing operation that had denuded it, and in a little more than a decade they had reforested it with multi-species, brought the water table back up, and created a healthy, vibrant sort of economy based on that. One individual, himself over 30 years, planted. There's an example of, there's an Israeli guy who moved to India near the Sri Aurobindo ashram and has about 70 acres that he's transformed into a forest sort of permaculture. People have seen these, but it's very intense management of the water flow. This one's hard to see, but people planted on the edge of the shore a mangrove and brought back fisheries, estuaries and so forth that helped the economy. So I just want to point to a couple of books. This one has recently come out, which focuses more on the agricultural side of it. You're welcome to look at it. There was another one published about a year ago by Tom Garreau. Sorry, I skipped by it. Maybe didn't make it in the slide, called Geotherapy, which surveys a range of things from agriculture to biochar to remineralization. And we have a local resource in Paul Tukey, who published this book on organic lawn care. I don't know if you're familiar with the Glenstone Museum up in Potomac, but Paul Tukey is now managing these grounds. So if you want advice on how you can manage your own, and they are actually drawing down CO2 and building soil organic matter in the ground. Every 1% increase in soil organic matter per acre means that about 50,000 gallons of water can be stored. So this is a way of addressing drought, flood issues. And I'm going to skip. This is showing transpiration that I mentioned earlier, the steam coming up from the forest. Beavers, when Pilgrims landed in North America, about 10% of the U.S. North American continent was underwater due to beaver ponds. They were all trapped out. We're down to about 1/10 of the beaver population. If we let beavers come back, they will do the geoengineering to keep the water on the land and allow it to percolate into the groundwater. This is rainfall for the U.S., the driest state, Nevada. Carol Evans, a biologist, and John Griggs, a rancher, in partnership over a number of years, allowed beavers to come back, and they've restored wetlands in Nevada, which gets the least amount of rainfall in the U.S. So if we can do it there, we can do it everywhere. A couple local examples, and then I'll stop. This is up in Bowie, Maryland. Guys are working on about 10 acres of land and trying to turn it into a food-producing forest. Fascinating. They lead workshops. It's called Forested. The URL is forested.us if you want to learn more. And then on the eastern shore, western shore, down near St. Mary's City, there's this farm that's trying to use holistic planned grazing to produce grass-fed beef. And there's a guy named Will Mitchell, he's in the front here, Tenleytown Meat Company, if you're interested in grass-fed, grass-finished, which I learned is an important adjective, grass-finished, make sure it's finished on the land as well, as a way of supporting an economy that would actually draw down carbon. So I'll stop there.